The weight of the serving tray cut into Marcus Williams' shoulder as he navigated between the crowded tables of Le Bernardin, the upscale restaurant where he had been working as a waiter for exactly 3 weeks. The starched white shirt clung to his back with nervous sweat, and the black bow tie felt like a noose around his neck as he approached table 12, where a middle-aged couple sat studying their menus with the kind of entitled scrutiny that came from never having to check prices. Marcus had built a tech empire worth $200 million, had shaken hands with senators and celebrities, had been featured on magazine covers as one of the most successful entrepreneurs of his generation. But tonight, like every night for the past month, he was just another black man in a service uniform, invisible until needed, dismissed the moment his usefulness ended. If you've ever wondered what the world really thinks when they believe no one important is watching, stay with me, because what this man discovered will shatter every assumption you have about human decency. "Excuse me, are you our waiter?" The woman's voice carried the particular brand of impatience that suggested she had been waiting longer than her sense of entitlement could tolerate, though Marcus had only been assigned to their table 30 seconds earlier. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a style that probably cost more than most people made in a week, and her jewelry caught the restaurant's ambient lighting like small stars against her pale skin. "Yes, ma'am, I'm Marcus, and I'll be taking care of you this evening. Can I start you with something to drink?" He kept his voice steady and professional, the same tone he had practiced in the mirror of his downtown penthouse before coming to work each night, learning to make himself smaller, less threatening, more palatable to customers who expected their servers to know their place. The woman barely looked at him, her attention focused on her phone as she spoke. "We'll have a bottle of the Chateau Margaux, the 2010, and make sure it's properly decanted. The last waiter we had clearly didn't know the difference between a Bordeaux and a Beaujolais." Her husband chuckled at what was apparently meant to be a joke, though his eyes held the cold amusement of someone who found humor in other people's perceived ignorance. Marcus nodded, making notes on his pad while calculating that the wine they had just ordered cost more than many of his fellow servers made in a month. "Excellent choice. I'll have the sommelier prepare that for you right away. Have you had a chance to look at our appetizer selection?" "We're not ready to order yet," the man said, his tone suggesting that Marcus should have known this without asking. "And when we are, we'll let you know. We don't need you hovering around our table like some kind of vulture." The casual cruelty in his voice was delivered with the same ease as ordering wine, as if reducing another human being to an annoyance was simply part of the dining experience. As Marcus walked away from the table, he felt the familiar knot forming in his stomach, the same sick feeling he had experienced dozens of times over the past 3 weeks as he witnessed the casual racism and classism that permeated the restaurant industry. He had embarked on this experiment after reading a study about workplace discrimination, curious to understand firsthand what millions of service workers experienced daily. The reality had been far worse than anything he had imagined. The idea had come to him during a board meeting at his company, Williams Tech Solutions, when his head of human resources had presented data about employee satisfaction and workplace culture. The statistics about discrimination in service industries had been sobering, but Marcus had found himself wondering if the reports were exaggerated, if perhaps the complaints were overblown by people who simply didn't understand the realities of business. That skepticism felt naive now, replaced by a bone-deep understanding of how quickly dignity could be stripped away by people who saw service workers as less than human. He made his way to the wine cellar, where Thomas, the sommelier, was already preparing the expensive bottle with the reverence it commanded. Thomas was a soft-spoken man in his 50s who had worked at Le Bernardin for over a decade, and he had become something of a mentor to Marcus during his brief tenure as a server. "Table 12 again?" Thomas asked, noting the wine selection. "The Hendersons? They come in twice a month and treat the staff like furniture. I've seen them make 3 different servers cry over the years." He handled the bottle with practiced care, his movements precise and economical. "You're handling them better than most. Where did you learn to deal with difficult customers? Marcus hesitated, the lie coming easier now after weeks of practice, previous restaurant experience. You learned to develop thick skin. The truth was that his experience came from years of high-stakes business negotiations, from learning to read people's motivations and manage their expectations, skills that translated surprisingly well to navigating the minefield of customer service. Well, whatever you learned, it's working. Chef noticed that your tables have fewer complaints than most of the new hires. Keep it up and you might make it past the 3-month mark. Most people wash out before then. Thomas's praise was genuine, but it carried the weight of someone who had seen too many good people broken by the relentless pressure of serving people who viewed them as disposable. Marcus returned to table 12 with the wine, performing the ritual of presenting the bottle and pouring a small taste for the husband's approval. The man swirled the wine with exaggerated expertise, took a sip, and nodded curtly. It's acceptable. Fill them up. No, please, no thank you, just a command delivered to someone whose humanity didn't register on his radar. As Marcus poured the wine, he caught fragments of the couple's conversation, their voices carrying the casual confidence of people who had never learned to moderate their opinions around service staff. The neighborhood is really going downhill, the woman was saying. Too many of those people moving in, bringing their problems with them. Property values are going to tank if something isn't done. That's why we're looking at the house in Westchester, her husband replied. Better schools, better neighbors, if you know what I mean. Sometimes you have to pay extra for quality. The coded language was clear enough, and Marcus felt his jaw clench as he finished pouring their wine, his hands steady despite the anger building in his chest. Will you be ordering appetizers this evening? Marcus asked, his voice betraying none of the turmoil he felt inside. We'll have the oysters, but make sure they're fresh. Last time we were here, they tasted like they'd been sitting out for hours. And we want them properly shucked, not that sloppy job your kitchen usually does. The woman's complaints were delivered with the authority of someone who believed her dissatisfaction was always justified, regardless of the facts. Marcus knew for certain that the oysters were fresh, having watched the delivery arrive that morning and seen the careful inspection process the kitchen staff performed on all seafood. But he simply nodded and smiled, adding another small humiliation to the growing collection he had accumulated over the past month. The evening continued in much the same pattern, with Marcus navigating between tables filled with customers who seemed to view their servers as a different species entirely. At table 6, a group of business executives discussed a merger while completely ignoring Marcus's presence, talking about laying off workers as if he weren't standing 3 feet away taking their order. At table 15, a young couple on what appeared to be a first date made jokes about the help while Marcus refilled their water glasses, their laughter sharp and cruel in the restaurant's refined atmosphere. But it was during his break, sitting in the staff room with his fellow servers, that Marcus heard the stories that truly broke his heart. Maria, a single mother who had been working at the restaurant for 5 years, described customers who snapped their fingers to get her attention, who called her girl despite her being in her 30s, who left messes on purpose because they knew someone else would have to clean them up. And the worst part, Maria said, unwrapping a sandwich she had brought from home because she couldn't afford to eat at the restaurant where she worked, is when they act like they're doing you a favor by letting you serve them. Like your job exists for their entertainment, not because you need to pay rent and feed your kids. James, a college student working nights to pay for his education, nodded in agreement. I had a guy last week tell me I should be grateful for the opportunity to learn about fine dining from him. Like watching him eat $100 steak was some kind of masterclass in sophistication. His voice carried the bitter edge of someone who had learned too young that respect was often a luxury reserved for those who could afford it. Marcus listened to these stories with growing horror, realizing that his own experiences over the past month were not aberrations, but the daily reality for millions of workers who had no choice but to endure treatment that would be considered unacceptable in any other context. The casual cruelty, the assumption of superiority, the complete disregard for the humanity of people whose only crime was needing to work for a living. It painted a picture of society that Marcus had never seen from his position of privilege and power. The breaking point came during his fourth week, on a busy Saturday night when the restaurant was packed with the kind of wealthy clientele that treated dining out as a performance of their own importance. Marcus had been assigned to a large table celebrating someone's birthday, a group of 8 people who had been drinking heavily and growing louder with each course. "Hey boy, we need more bread over here," one of the men called out, snapping his fingers in Marcus's direction. The word hit like a physical blow, carrying centuries of history and hatred in its casual delivery. Marcus felt his vision blur for a moment, his carefully constructed composure threatening to crack under the weight of such blatant disrespect. "Of course, sir. I'll bring that right out," Marcus managed to say, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. He walked to the kitchen on unsteady legs, his hands shaking as he arranged fresh bread in a basket, fighting the urge to walk out the door and never come back. "You okay, Marcus?" Chef Rodriguez had noticed his distress, her kind eyes filled with concern. She was one of the few people in the restaurant who treated all the staff with equal respect, regardless of their position in the hierarchy. "Just a difficult table," Marcus replied, not trusting himself to say more. "I saw what happened. That man is a regular, and he's always like that. Management won't do anything because he spends too much money here." Her voice carried the resignation of someone who had seen too many good people ground down by a system that prioritized profit over human dignity. "And if you need to take a few minutes, I can have someone else cover your tables." Marcus shook his head, knowing that walking away would only confirm what people like the man at table 8 believed about people who looked like him. "I'm fine. Thank you, though." When he returned to the table with the bread, the conversation had turned to politics, with the group expressing opinions about immigration and welfare that made Marcus's stomach turn. They spoke about those people with the casual disdain of individuals who had never experienced want or discrimination, who viewed poverty as a moral failing rather than a systemic problem. "The problem is, they don't want to work," one woman was saying, gesturing with her wine glass for emphasis. "They'd rather live off handouts than earn an honest living." It's a cultural problem, really. The irony of her statement, delivered to a man who was literally working to serve her while she sat in judgment of people she had never met, was apparently lost on her. Marcus set down the bread basket with careful precision, his movements controlled despite the fury coursing through his veins. "Is there anything else I can get for you?" he asked, his professionalism intact, even as his faith in humanity crumbled a little more. "Actually, yes," the birthday celebrant said, his voice slurred with alcohol and entitlement. "We want to send a bottle of champagne to our friends at table 4, but we want you to tell them it's from us. Make sure they know who sent it. We're important people, and we want them to know we're thinking of them." Marcus nodded and made his way to table 4, where he delivered the champagne and the message as requested. But what he overheard as he walked away made his blood run cold. The recipients of the champagne were discussing him and his fellow servers with the same casual cruelty he had witnessed all evening. "But did you see the way that waiter was looking at us?" one of them said. "Like he was planning something. You can't trust them, you know. They smile and act friendly, but they're always thinking about what they can take from you." The paranoia and prejudice in their voices was breathtaking, the assumption that his mere presence was somehow threatening despite his obvious professionalism and courtesy. Marcus realized in that moment that no amount of education, success, or respectability could shield him from the toxic assumptions that some people carried about anyone who looked like him. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and swallowed insults, each interaction adding another layer to Marcus's growing understanding of the daily humiliations that service workers endured. By the time he clocked out at midnight, he felt emotionally and physically drained, hollowed out by the constant assault on his dignity and humanity. He walked to his car in the restaurant's parking lot, his expensive vehicle looking out of place among the older, more modest cars driven by his fellow servers. The contrast was a stark reminder of the double life he was living, the strange experiment that had revealed truths about society that he wished he could unknown. The drive back to his penthouse took him through the city's economic geography, from the affluent neighborhood where the restaurant was located to the downtown district where his building rose like a glass tower against the night sky. But the physical distance felt meaningless compared to the emotional journey he had taken over the past month, the transformation from naive curiosity to heartbroken understanding. In his apartment, surrounded by the trappings of his success, Marcus sat at his kitchen island and tried to process what he had experienced. The casual racism, the assumption of superiority, the complete dehumanization of people whose only crime was needing to work for a living. It painted a picture of society that was far darker than anything he had imagined from his position of privilege. But what haunted him most were not the obvious moments of cruelty, but the subtle ones. The way customers looked through him as if he didn't exist, the way they discussed intimate details of their lives as if he were furniture, the way they assumed he was too stupid or unimportant to understand their conversations. The cumulative effect of these small humiliations was perhaps more damaging than any single act of overt racism, wearing away at a person's sense of worth like water eroding stone. Marcus thought about Maria, working 5 years at a job where customers treated her like a servant, struggling to support her children while enduring daily indignities that would break most people. He thought about James, sacrificing his dignity night after night to pay for an education that might, if he was lucky, lift him out of a world where his worth was measured by his willingness to smile while being insulted. The next morning, Marcus called his assistant and cleared his schedule for the day. He had decisions to make, changes to implement, a reckoning to face with his own assumptions and privileges. The experiment had ended, but the real work was just beginning. He started by researching the restaurant industry, diving deep into studies about worker treatment, wage theft, discrimination, and the psychological toll of service work. The statistics were sobering, but they paled in comparison to the lived experience he had gained over the past month. Numbers could be dismissed or rationalized, but the memory of being called boy by a man who viewed him as subhuman would stay with him forever. Marcus then began reaching out to organizations that advocated for service workers, learning about the systemic issues that kept millions of people trapped in cycles of poverty and disrespect. He discovered that the treatment he had experienced was not only common, but often much worse, that sexual harassment, wage theft, and outright abuse were endemic in an industry that relied on the desperation of workers who had few other options. The revelation that changed everything came when Marcus decided to return to Le Bernardin one final time, not as a server, but as himself, to observe the restaurant from the other side of the equation. He made a reservation under his real name, wore one of his expensive suits, and arrived at the same establishment where he had spent a month being treated as invisible. The difference in treatment was immediate and stark. The hostess greeted him with genuine warmth, the sommelier personally recommended wines, and the servers attended to his every need with the kind of respect he had never received while wearing their uniform. But what shocked him most was recognizing some of the same customers who had treated him with such contempt just days earlier. Table 12 was occupied by the same couple who had dismissed him as a vulture, but now they nodded politely when he walked past, their hostility replaced by the deference they showed to someone they perceived as their social equal. The birthday party from the previous week was celebrating another occasion, but the man who had called him boy now made eye contact and smiled, apparently seeing him as human for the first time. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. The realization that respect was not earned through character or competence, but simply by wearing the right clothes and occupying the right social position. Marcus understood now that the problem was not individual prejudice, but systemic dehumanization, a culture that taught people to value others based on their perceived status rather than their inherent worth. What would you do if you discovered that your entire understanding of fairness and equality was built on a foundation of privilege and ignorance? Tell me in the comments how you would confront the uncomfortable truths about the world you thought you knew. That evening, Marcus called an emergency meeting of his company's board of directors. He had prepared a presentation that would shock them, a detailed account of his month undercover and a comprehensive plan for addressing the systemic inequalities he had discovered. The boardroom fell silent as he described his experiences, the casual cruelty and dehumanization that millions of workers face daily. What I discovered, Marcus said, his voice heavy with emotion, is that we live in two different worlds, separated not by geography but by perception. The same people who treat service workers like animals will show respect to those same individuals if they believe they have status or power. The problem isn't individual prejudice. It's a system that teaches people to value others based on their economic position rather than their humanity. He outlined his plan to address these issues, starting with his own company but extending far beyond. Marcus proposed creating a foundation dedicated to improving working conditions in the service industry, funding legal aid for workers facing discrimination and supporting legislation that would protect the dignity and rights of all workers regardless of their position. But the most radical proposal was his decision to use his wealth and influence to create a new model for the restaurant industry, one that paid living wages, provided comprehensive benefits, and treated all employees with the respect they deserved. He would start by purchasing Le Bernardin and transforming it into a showcase for how the industry could operate when profit was balanced with human dignity. The transformation of Le Bernardin began immediately, with Marcus implementing policies that revolutionized the restaurant's culture. Servers were paid living wages rather than relying on tips. Comprehensive health care was provided to all employees, and a zero-tolerance policy was established for customer abuse of staff. Most importantly, Marcus instituted regular training sessions for both staff and management about dignity, respect, and the importance of treating every person as valuable regardless of their role. The changes were not without challenges. Some long-time customers complained about the new policies, particularly the requirement that they treat staff with basic respect. A few even took their business elsewhere, unable to adapt to an environment where their sense of superiority was not constantly validated by the subservience of others. But the positive changes far outweighed the negatives. Employee turnover dropped dramatically. Customer satisfaction increased as the staff became more engaged and professional, and the restaurant began attracting a new clientele that valued the ethical treatment of workers. Most importantly, the toxic culture that had normalized cruelty and dehumanization was replaced by an environment where everyone's dignity was protected and respected. Marcus also used his platform to speak publicly about his experience, sharing his story at conferences and in interviews, challenging other business leaders to examine their own assumptions and practices. The response was mixed, with some dismissing his account as exaggerated or self-serving, but many others were moved to action, implementing changes in their own organizations and supporting broader efforts to address systemic inequality. The foundation Marcus established grew rapidly, funded not only by his own wealth, but by donations from others who had been inspired by his story. The organization provided legal support for workers facing discrimination, funded research into workplace inequality, and lobbied for legislation that would protect the rights and dignity of all workers. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was on the individuals whose lives were directly touched by these changes. Maria, the single mother who had endured years of disrespect, was promoted to assistant manager and given the resources to pursue her dream of opening her own restaurant. James completed his education with the help of a scholarship from Marcus's foundation and went on to become a successful lawyer specializing in workers' rights. Thomas, the sommelier who had mentored Marcus during his time as a server, became the restaurant's general manager, using his decades of experience to create an environment where both staff and customers could thrive. Under his leadership, Le Bernardin became a model for the industry, proving that treating workers with dignity was not only morally right, but also good for business. The ripple effects of Marcus's experiment extended far beyond the restaurant industry. His story inspired other wealthy individuals to examine their own assumptions and privileges, leading to a broader conversation about inequality and the importance of treating all people with respect, regardless of their economic status. Universities began incorporating his experience into their business curricula, using it as a case study in ethical leadership and social responsibility. Years later, Marcus would look back on his month as a waiter as the most important period of his life, not because of the business success it generated, but because of the human understanding it provided. The experience had shattered his assumptions about merit and fairness, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable truth that respect and dignity were often privileges reserved for those with economic power, rather than rights extended to all people. The casual cruelty he had witnessed and experienced had broken his heart, but it had also opened his eyes to the possibility of change. By using his privilege and resources to address systemic inequality, Marcus had discovered that the same power that could dehumanize could also be used to restore dignity and create justice. The restaurant where he had once been called Boy now stood as a testament to the possibility of transformation. A place where every person was valued not for their economic status, but for their inherent worth as human beings. The servers who had once endured daily humiliations now worked in an environment where their dignity was protected and their contributions were recognized. But the most lasting legacy of Marcus's experiment was the understanding that change was possible, that the systems that perpetuated inequality were not inevitable, but were choices that could be unmade by people willing to confront uncomfortable truths and take meaningful action. The heart that had been broken by witnessing humanity's capacity for cruelty had been healed by discovering its equal capacity for compassion and justice. If this story has opened your eyes to the invisible struggles happening around you every day, if it's challenged you to examine your own assumptions about worth and dignity, then share it with others who need to hear this message. Because somewhere today, someone is being dehumanized by a system that values status over character. And it will take all of us working together to build a world where everyone's humanity is recognized and respected.